The red marker slammed against the whiteboard hard enough that it snapped clean in half. Victoria Hastings stood frozen for 3 full seconds, staring at the broken pieces in her hand like they were evidence of a crime she'd just committed in front of witnesses who would never let her forget. 20 engineers sat motionless around the conference table at Nexus Technologies, their faces pale under fluorescent lights that made everyone look half dead, even on good days. Harvard diplomas, MIT credentials, Stanford PhDs hanging on office walls like participation trophies that meant nothing when the system you'd promised the United States Department of Defense would revolutionize battlefield logistics couldn't tell the difference between a supply convoy and a school bus. 72 hours. That's all she had left before everything she'd built over 40 years. Every all-nighter, every missed birthday, every relationship sacrificed on the altar of proving everyone wrong about what a woman her age could accomplish would belong to someone else. The room felt like a tomb. Victoria's reflection stared back from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle's skyline, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. 61 years old, CEO of a billion-dollar company. 47 hours without sleep, running on coffee that had stopped working somewhere around dawn yesterday. Her hands shook slightly as she set the broken marker on the table. Not from caffeine. From the bone-deep certainty that she was about to lose everything that mattered and discover too late that none of it had mattered at all. Dr. James Crawford cleared his throat with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. 23 years in artificial intelligence research, PhD from Caltech, salary of $400,000 a year, not counting stock options that would be worthless by Monday. He typed something on his laptop, and the main screen flickered to life with numbers cascading down in neat columns. Every single metric glowing red to indicate failure across every parameter they'd promised would work. The neural network is hitting resistance in the decision tree architecture. We've recalibrated the weighted nodes 17 times, adjusted the learning parameters across 43 iterations, restructured the entire algorithmic framework from the ground up. English, James. Victoria's voice came out quieter than she intended. Dangerous quiet, the kind that made junior staff members find urgent reasons to be anywhere else. Pretend I'm not paying you $400,000 a year to confuse me with jargon. Crawford's jaw tightened in a way that told her he'd spent 3 days trying to save this project, 3 days of his team working around the clock, ordering takeout at midnight, sleeping under their desks, and he had nothing to show for it except bags under his eyes and the growing certainty that they were all about to be fired. His voice cracked slightly on the words he'd been avoiding for 72 hours. It's broken, and we don't know why. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. Victoria turned slowly to face the room, and 20 pairs of eyes found suddenly fascinating things to look at. The table, their laptops, the coffee stains on the whiteboard. Anywhere but at the woman who'd built this company from nothing when every venture capitalist in San Francisco told her a woman her age should be home with her grandchildren instead of pitching AI defense contracts. Her phone buzzed against the table. A text from her daughter Amy, preview showing a photo, a crayon drawing, stick figures holding hands. The caption read, "Grandma and Lily. She's been carrying this around for a week, waiting to give it to you. When are you coming to visit?" It's been 3 months, Mom. 3 months since she'd seen her 8-year-old granddaughter. 3 months of promising next weekend, next month, as soon as this project stabilizes. And now the project was dying, and she still hadn't made time for a little girl who thought her grandmother had forgotten she existed. Victoria shoved the phone in her pocket without opening the full message. "Everyone out!" She straightened, CEO mask sliding back into place like armor she'd learned to wear so well it had fused to her skin. Don't come back until you have something that works. I don't care if you have to rebuild it from scratch. I don't care if you have to sleep here. Figure it out." They fled like students dismissed from detention, 20 brilliant minds scrambling for the door, all except Elizabeth Carson, her VP of Operations, and the only person in this building who'd ever seen Victoria cry. Once, 15 years ago, when they found Robert slumped over his desk, coffee still warm, heart already cold. Beth lingered near the door, her hand on the frame, looking like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find words that wouldn't make everything worse. "You should go home." Her voice carried the gentle insistence of someone who'd been having this argument for years and knew she'd already lost. "See Lily. She's 8 now, Victoria. These years don't come back." Victoria didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know how to be a grandmother. She knew how to run board meetings and close deals and fire people who weren't performing at the level excellence demanded. But sitting on the floor playing tea party with stuffed animals required a kind of presence she'd forgotten how to access, or maybe had never learned in the first place. Too busy proving she could build empires in a world that told her women like her were supposed to settle for supporting roles. "I'll see her when I've saved her inheritance." The words came out harsher than intended, sharp enough that Beth flinched, but she didn't argue, just shook her head with the resignation of someone who'd given up trying to save people from themselves and left Victoria alone with the city glittering through the windows. 11:47 at night, and Seattle was still alive. Restaurants full of people having dinner with their families. Movie theaters where couples held hands in the dark. Living rooms where grandparents read bedtime stories to children who would remember their voices forever, long after memory became the only thing left to prove they'd mattered. An entire world of people who'd figured out how to balance work and life while Victoria stood in an empty conference room at midnight, choosing the company over everything else again, the way she'd chosen it over Robert's last months, over Amy's childhood, over every moment that might have filled the hollow space where her heart used to be before she replaced it with quarterly earnings reports and market share projections. When did I become this person? The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome. When did saving the company become more important than the people I'm supposed to be saving it for? Her reflection in the window looked like a stranger. Expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 10 pounds in the last month because eating required time she didn't have. Gray hair pulled back so tight it made her scalp ache, a defense mechanism against the softness people associated with weakness. Eyes with dark circles that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. Evidence of a war she was losing one sleepless night at a time. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who'd sacrificed everything for success and was only now realizing success couldn't love her back, couldn't hold her when she cried, couldn't tell her she was enough, just as she was. Instead of demanding she prove it again and again until she died at her desk like Robert, alone, with coffee going cold. The phone buzzed again. Amy calling this time, not texting, which meant she was angry or worried or both. Victoria stared at the screen until it went to voicemail, then listened to the message with her forehead pressed against the cold glass, looking down at the city and wondering how many other people were standing in tall buildings right now, realizing they'd climbed to heights that left them too far from Earth to remember what ground felt like. "Mom, you actually picked up voicemail." The disappointment in Amy's voice hurt worse than anger would have, the kind of quiet pain that comes from giving up on hope. "Lily was waiting up for you to call, but it's almost midnight and she fell asleep on the couch. She asked me tonight why Grandma doesn't love her anymore." Victoria's chest seized. "I told her that's not true, that Grandma loves her very much, that Grandma is just very busy saving the world." Amy paused, and in that silence, Victoria heard every broken promise, every missed recital, every phone call cut short because a meeting ran long. "But Mom, She's 8. She doesn't understand busy. She just understands not here. The message ended. Victoria stood in the darkness of her corner office, surrounded by awards and achievements and 40 years of proving everyone wrong. And she had never felt more alone in her life. Jumped. Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart through the executive floor of Nexus Technologies with the efficiency of a man who'd perfected the art of being furniture. Gray uniform, worn Nike sneakers with the sole separating on the left one earbud in his left ear playing nothing because he'd learned years ago that people left you alone if you looked occupied. The other ear stayed free to listen for footsteps, voices, any sign that someone might need him to be even more invisible than usual. 52 years old, white guy with graying hair that had gone from brown to silver, faster than seemed fair, calloused hands that had spent 13 years holding mops instead of the research papers he'd once dreamed of publishing back when the future looked different and Catherine was alive and the world made sense. Single father to an 8-year-old daughter who thought her dad was the smartest person in the world and had no idea he'd once been 2 semesters away from a PhD at MIT, back before life taught him that brilliance meant nothing compared to being there when the people you loved were dying, and all you could do was hold their hand and lie about how everything would be okay. The executive floor at this hour was a ghost town. Just the hum of servers in the data center down the hall and the occasional security guard making rounds, nodding at Marcus like he was part of the building itself, as permanent and unremarkable as the elevator or the water fountain or any other fixture people used without thinking about. Marcus had worked this shift for 3 years and could walk every hallway blindfolded by now. He knew which offices had personal photos on the desks and which ones were sterile as operating rooms. He knew which engineers left their code visible on monitors, trusting the janitor wouldn't understand what he was looking at. He knew which bathrooms ran out of soap by Thursday and needed early refills. He knew everything about Nexus Technologies except how to stop being invisible long enough to matter. He rounded the corner toward the main conference room and stopped. The lights were still on. That was unusual. Most nights by 11:30, the place was dark except for emergency exits and the red glow of charging stations where laptops sat plugged in, waiting for morning and the people who'd abandoned them. Marcus approached the glass walls cautiously, prepared to turn around if someone was still working late. The CEO sometimes stayed until dawn, though she usually holed up in her private office instead of the common areas where people might see her looking human. The room was empty now. But the whiteboards... Marcus forgot about his cart, forgot about staying invisible, forgot about the carefully constructed boundaries that kept night janitors separate from the people whose messes they cleaned up. His hand caught the door handle and he stepped inside without thinking, drawn forward by something he hadn't felt in 13 years. Recognition. The equations covering every inch of whiteboard space weren't random corporate brainstorming or motivational slogans or the usual nonsense that passed for innovation in conference rooms. These were advanced neural network architectures, decision tree mapping, algorithmic structures he'd once understood the way other people understood their native language, back when he was going to change the world, and the world hadn't yet reminded him that changing the world required privilege he didn't have and choices he couldn't make. And in the center of the main board, circled in angry red marker with slash marks cutting through it like a murder scene, was a problem that made his heart stop. They're using linear regression on an exponential growth model. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Adrenaline flooding his system the way it used to when he'd solve problems at 2 in the morning in his MIT dorm room, feeling like a god, invincible and brilliant, and certain the universe would bend to equations if you just found the right ones. The weighted nodes aren't accounting for temporal decay. The feedback loop is completely ignoring real-world chaos, trying to impose order on systems that resist order by their very nature. Marcus stepped closer, his reflection in the whiteboard showing a middle-aged janitor in a faded uniform that smelled like cleaning chemicals and defeat. But his mind was moving at speeds it hadn't reached since the night Catherine got her diagnosis, and the future he'd planned shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble into anything resembling hope. The solution was obvious. So obvious that 20 PhDs had missed it. But then again, they'd been trained to see problems as things to conquer through force of intellect. Marcus had been trained by life to see systems as things to understand, to work with instead of against, to bend without breaking, because breaking meant Sophie didn't eat, and the rent didn't get paid, and everything he'd sacrificed to keep her safe would be for nothing. There was a difference. Not your problem. The voice in his head sounded like Catherine, the way she'd sounded near the end when morphine couldn't touch the pain, but she still tried to smile for him, still worried about him more than herself because that's who she was. Not your job. Clean the board and move on. His hand was shaking when he picked up the cloth, raised it toward the whiteboard, and couldn't do it. 13 years. 13 years of reading every paper he could find in the public library after his shift ended, sitting under fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, teaching himself new frameworks on used textbooks he bought at Goodwill for $3 each. 13 years of solving theoretical problems in his head while mopping floors because his brain refused to let go of the work he'd loved more than anything except his wife and daughter. The work that had felt like breathing before he had to choose between breathing and being present for the two people who made breathing worthwhile. 13 years of watching his knowledge rust while life demanded he choose survival over growth, existence over excellence, invisibility over the kind of presence that invited people to see him as more than the person who emptied their trash cans. And here, written in red marker like a gift from a universe that owed him several, was the kind of problem he used to solve before breakfast, back when breakfast meant coffee and optimism instead of pancakes, with Sophie and the constant low-grade terror that he wasn't enough, would never be enough, could never give her what she deserved. "What are you doing?" His brain screamed at him with the voice of survival, the part that had kept him alive when Catherine died and he'd wanted to follow her into the dark. "You're going to get fired. Sophie needs to eat. You have rent due in 5 days. But his hand was already moving toward the red marker lying on the table, already picking it up, already testing its weight like a weapon he'd once wielded with precision, back before he learned that precision meant nothing when the people you loved were dying and no equation could save them. 5 minutes. That's all it would take. Swap the regression model for a sigmoid function. Redistribute the weighted nodes across the temporal axis to account for how systems evolved over time, instead of pretending time was a constant. Add a feedback loop that accounted for chaos theory principles instead of trying to impose order on inherently random systems, accepting that some things couldn't be controlled, only understood and worked with. 5 minutes to prove he wasn't irrelevant. 5 minutes to remember what it felt like to be good at something that mattered instead of just good enough to keep the lights on. Catherine's voice in his memory, clear as if she were standing next to him instead of buried 6 years in a cemetery he visited every Sunday with Sophie, who left drawings she made at school because she thought Grandma Catherine would want to see them. The promise she'd made him make while holding his hand so tight it hurt. Her grip the only thing keeping him tethered to a world that had taken her and expected him to keep going anyway. When the door opens, Marcus, not Nathan, his name was Marcus now, after 13 years of being nobody. When the door opens, walk through it. Promise me. Don't let fear make you invisible forever. His hand was steady when he touched marker to whiteboard, steadier than it had been in years, muscle memory taking over, equations flowing out like a language he'd spoken fluently in another life. Sigmoid correction here, accounting for the natural S-curve of growth that linear models missed. Temporal decay compensation there, recognizing that data from 6 months ago wasn't as relevant as data from yesterday, that systems learned and evolved and you had to weight information accordingly. A complete restructure of the feedback architecture that would let the system learn from chaos instead of breaking against it like waves against rocks. When Marcus stepped back, the solution was so elegant it hurt. The kind of work he'd dreamed of doing when he was 25 and brilliant and certain he was going to change the world. Before the world reminded him that brilliance meant nothing compared to being there when the people you loved were dying, when your wife needed someone to hold her hair back while she vomited from chemo, when your daughter needed someone to read her bedtime stories because her mother was too weak to hold a book. He wiped his hands on his uniform. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in the empty room, could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in the certainty that he'd just done something either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave, and wouldn't know which until it was too late to take it back. The rational part of his brain was screaming to erase everything, to clean it off before anyone saw, before he lost the only job keeping a roof over Sophie's head and food in her stomach. But the part that had spent 13 years buried under survival instincts couldn't bring himself to destroy this evidence that Marcus Webb was more than a man who cleaned toilets for people who wouldn't remember his name if you asked them 5 minutes after he left the room. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus spun around. Victoria Hastings stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes locked on the whiteboard before shifting to him with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously seen and dissected. Her expression was unreadable in the way of people who'd spent decades learning to hide everything that mattered. Exhaustion showed around her eyes, but underneath was something sharper. Curiosity, maybe. Or calculation. The room felt smaller suddenly. Marcus became acutely aware of his gray uniform with the name tag that said "Maintenance" in block letters instead of his actual name, because someone in HR 3 years ago had decided individual janitor names didn't matter enough to waste time programming into the badge system. He became aware of the mop bucket still visible through the glass walls, of the cart with cleaning supplies, of every marker that separated him from the woman standing in front of him, wearing a suit that probably cost more than he made in 2 months. "You're the night janitor." Victoria's voice wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the precision of someone categorizing a problem to be solved, filing information away for later use. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus's throat felt dry, words coming out rough. "Marcus Webb, I was just cleaning and I saw the problem and I thought, you saw a $100 million algorithm failing and decided to fix it with your mop?" Victoria walked past him, not toward him, but past him like he was furniture to navigate around, someone to move aside for rather than acknowledge as human. Her eyes scanned the whiteboard with laser focus, taking in every correction he'd made, every adjustment to their failed architecture, processing faster than he could track. "I'm sorry." Marcus heard the words coming out of his mouth from very far away, the part of him that had learned to apologize for existing, for taking up space, for daring to matter. "I shouldn't have touched it. I'll wipe it clean right now. I can—" "Don't move." Victoria pulled out her phone, started photographing the whiteboard from multiple angles with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to document everything, to trust nothing to memory when memory failed you at the worst possible moments. Her fingers flew across the screen, sending images somewhere to someone, evidence that would either save him or destroy him, and he wouldn't know which until too late. "Ma'am, please." Marcus felt the ground shifting under his feet, felt 13 years of careful invisibility crumbling because he'd been stupid enough to believe he could matter again, that doors could open for people like him. "I can't lose this job. I have a daughter. She's 8 years old. She's all I have and I'm all she has." Victoria didn't look at him. She was still studying the whiteboard, still photographing, still processing in that way very intelligent people did when something didn't fit their model of how the world was supposed to work. Her phone rang and she answered without taking her eyes off his corrections, voice sharp and focused. "Beth, conference room now. Emergency." She hung up. The silence stretched like taffy, pulling longer and thinner until Marcus thought he might suffocate on the tension. "What's your name again?" Victoria finally turned to face him, Really look at him instead of through him. Marcus? Marcus Webb, ma'am. Where did you study? I didn't. I started at MIT, but I never finished. My wife got sick. I had to drop out to take care of her. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not pity. Marcus had learned to recognize pity in all its forms, the way it looked different depending on whether people thought you deserved it or had brought misfortune on yourself through poor choices. This wasn't pity. This was the look of someone recalculating an equation, adjusting variables, running a new simulation in her head. MIT. Really? Victoria's eyes focused on him with sudden intensity that felt like being trapped in a spotlight. You were at MIT studying what exactly? Machine learning and neural network architecture. But that was 13 years ago, before life happened, before everything changed, and I had to become someone else. The door burst open. Beth Carson rushed in, still pulling on her jacket over what looked like pajamas, hair in a messy ponytail, eyes alert despite the hour in the way of people who'd trained themselves to wake fully at a moment's notice because emergencies didn't care about sleep schedules. Victoria, what's wrong? Did something happen with the system? Did Crawford— Tell me what you see. Victoria pointed at the whiteboard. Beth's eyes scanned the equations. Confusion melted into recognition. Recognition hardened into disbelief as the implications crystallized. Her hand went to her mouth. This is sigmoid correction with temporal decay compensation. Beth's voice came out barely above a whisper, like speaking too loud might make the solution disappear. If this actually works, it would solve the feedback loop problem completely. It would solve everything we've been breaking our heads over for 3 days straight. She turned to Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. The gray uniform, the mop bucket visible through glass, the weathered hands of someone who'd spent years doing manual labor instead of intellectual work. The janitor did this? Beth looked between Marcus and Victoria like she was waiting for the punchline to a joke she didn't understand yet. The janitor, Victoria confirmed, her expression still unreadable, but something in her posture changing. The exhaustion giving way to the steel that had built a billion-dollar company from nothing when everyone said it was impossible. That's impossible. Beth pulled out her tablet, fingers flying. This is PhD level work. Senior researcher level. This is— Run it! Victoria's voice cut through Beth's spiral like a knife through fog. Right now, run the simulation with his corrections and tell me if it works. Beth's hands shook slightly as she input the new parameters, the equations Marcus had written, the solution that was either genius or garbage, and they wouldn't know which until the numbers came back. The tablet screen loaded, processed, calculations running through algorithms that would determine whether Marcus had just saved himself or destroyed everything. Marcus held his breath. Sophie's face flashed through his mind, the way she smiled when he walked through the door at 7 a.m. sharp every morning, never early, never late. The one constant in a life that had taught her nothing was guaranteed. The way she trusted him to always be there even when he felt like he was failing at everything else, drowning in the gap between who he was and who he needed to be. The tablet beeped. Green bars filled the screen where red ones had been moments before. Metrics shifting from failure to success, from broken to functional, from hopeless to possible. Beth stared at the numbers like they were written in a language she'd thought she knew but suddenly couldn't read. Error reduction 63%. Her voice broke on the numbers, disbelief giving way to something that might have been hope or might have been terror at what this meant. Processing speed increase 41%. Victoria, it works. The silence was absolute. Marcus felt something cracking open in his chest, something that had been locked away for 13 years because hope was too expensive when you were choosing between rent and groceries. between keeping the lights on and keeping your daughter fed, between surviving and living. Who are you? Victoria's voice was quiet now, dangerous quiet, the kind that preceded earthquakes. And I want the truth this time, not the just a janitor story. The real story. Marcus looked at the whiteboard, at his corrections written in red marker that was probably expensive, the kind companies bought in bulk without thinking about cost. At 13 years of knowledge that had never gone away, just gone dormant, waiting for someone to ask the right question, to see him as something more than the person who emptied trash cans. I was going to change the world. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by years of swallowing everything he'd wanted to say. That was the plan. Finish my PhD at MIT, join a research lab, build AI systems that could actually help people instead of just optimizing ad clicks and making rich people richer. He paused. The memories hurt. They always hurt, sharp edges that had dulled but never disappeared. Then Catherine got diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. We had a newborn daughter, no insurance, medical bills that made my student loans look like pocket change. So I made a choice. I could stay in school and let someone else hold my wife's hand while she died, or I could drop out and be there for every single moment we had left. Beth was crying quietly, not even trying to hide it. Victoria's face had gone very still, in the way of people who'd learned to lock down every emotion because showing weakness invited attack. I dropped out 2 semesters before finishing, took care of Catherine for 18 months, held her hand through every chemo session, every radiation treatment, every night when the pain got so bad she couldn't sleep, and all I could do was lie next to her and promise our daughter would be okay, even though I had no idea how to make that promise true. Marcus's throat closed around the words, but he forced them out anyway, because if he was going to lose everything, he might as well lose it honestly. Then I held Sophie at Catherine's funeral and promised I'd do whatever it took to give her a good life, even if it meant cleaning toilets for people who look through me like I'm invisible. Even if it meant giving up everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed of becoming. Because she's worth more than any PhD, worth more than any career, worth more than pride. How old is your daughter? Victoria's voice was softer now, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. 8. Same as your granddaughter, I think. I've seen the photos on your desk when I empty your trash. Victoria went very still. Marcus hadn't meant to reveal that he paid attention to the personal details of executives' lives, that he knew from the dates on her calendar she kept canceling trips to visit family, that sometimes late at night when he was vacuuming the hallway outside her office, he could hear her crying, soft enough that she probably thought no one could hear. "What's her name?" Victoria asked. Sophie, after Catherine's grandmother, the one who raised her when her parents died young and taught her that family was something you chose every day, not just something you were born into. Does Sophie know about MIT, about who you used to be? Marcus shook his head. She knows I work nights. She knows I'm always there at 7 a.m. to make breakfast and braid her hair and walk her to the bus stop. That's enough. That has to be enough. Is it? The question hit harder than Marcus expected, landing in the space between who he was and who he'd had to become, in the gap he'd been trying to ignore for 13 years. Victoria sat down in one of the conference room chairs, not at the head of the table where the CEO usually commanded meetings like a general directing troops. Just a regular chair, like a regular person. For a moment, she looked less like the woman who built empires and more like someone who understood what it meant to lose things that mattered. "Sit down, Mr. Webb." Victoria's voice carried a weight that made it not quite an order, but definitely not a suggestion. The kind of tone that came from decades of making people do what she needed without them realizing they'd been persuaded. Marcus sat. The chair felt wrong, too comfortable. Too much like he belonged in rooms like this instead of cleaning them. Too much like the person he'd been at 25 instead of who he'd become at 52. Victoria leaned forward, elbows on the table. 40 years of corporate warfare in her eyes, but underneath something more human. Something that recognized pain because it had felt its own version in different circumstances with similar results. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Victoria's hands clasped together on the table, knuckles white with tension she was trying to hide. Can you do that again? Look at another problem and solve it the way you just did? What kind of problem? The kind worth $100 million. The kind that decides whether this company survives or dies. The kind that I can't solve alone anymore, no matter how many people I hire or how many hours I work. Victoria's voice cracked slightly on the admission, vulnerability showing through cracks in armor she'd worn so long it had become part of her skeleton. And I'm too proud to admit that to anyone except maybe you, because you've already seen me at my worst, and there's a certain freedom in having nothing left to hide. Marcus thought about Sophie, about the promise he'd made to Catherine, about 13 years of being invisible, and one night of finally being seen by someone who mattered enough to change everything or destroy it. I'd need to see the full system architecture. I'd need access to the existing code base. I'd need... Done. Victoria didn't hesitate, didn't consult anyone, didn't ask permission. You'll have whatever you need. I don't have security clearance. I don't have credentials. I don't have... You have results, Mr. Webb. Victoria's eyes held his with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. And right now, results matter more than anything else. More than protocol, more than credentials, more than the way things are supposed to work when the way things are supposed to work has already failed. Marcus felt the weight of the decision pressing down like atmosphere, like gravity, like all 13 years of survival instinct screaming that this was too big, too risky, too likely to end in failure that would prove everyone right about him being a washed-up dropout who couldn't hack it in the real world. I need to be home by 7 a.m. The words came out firm, non-negotiable, the one line he wouldn't cross no matter what was offered. Every morning, no exceptions. Sophie needs me to be there when she wakes up. That's not something I can compromise on. Victoria nodded slowly, respect showing in her eyes for the first time. Then we work around your schedule, whatever it takes. And if I can't actually solve it? If tonight was just luck? If I'm not as good as I used to be? If 13 years away from this work means I've lost whatever edge I had? Then you'll have tried. Victoria's voice was steady in a way that suggested she knew what it meant to fail at things that mattered. Which is more than most people do. Which is more than I can say I've done for the things that actually matter instead of just the things that look impressive on quarterly reports. She stood up, extended her hand across the table. Marcus looked at the perfectly manicured nails and expensive watch and everything it represented. A door opening, a chance to prove he wasn't just a man who cleaned floors, a risk that could destroy the fragile stability he'd built for Sophie, or could finally give them both something better than just surviving one day at a time. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who'd learned to project certainty even when terrified, who'd trained herself to show strength when drowning. One condition. Marcus's voice was steady now, decision made, consequences accepted. Nobody knows I'm the janitor. Not until we see if this actually works. I can't let Sophie find out her dad is trying to be a scientist again, and then watch me fail. I can't put her through hoping for something better and then having it taken away the way everything else gets taken away. Victoria's grip tightened slightly before she released his hand. Deal. She released his hand and adjusted her jacket, became the CEO again. The vulnerable woman who'd admitted she couldn't solve problems alone, disappearing behind professional competence like a mask sliding back into place. But Mr. Webb, Victoria paused at the doorway, her reflection in the glass walls looking smaller somehow, more human than the woman who commanded boardrooms. Stop calling yourself just anything. You just gave this company a chance to survive. That makes you anything but just. She walked out, heels clicking on polished floors. Beth followed after giving Marcus a look he couldn't quite read, something between respect and curiosity, and maybe a little bit of hope that things could be different than they'd always been. Marcus stood alone in the conference room, his reflection in the whiteboard showing a 52-year-old janitor in a gray uniform. But his hands were steady. His mind was moving faster than it had in 13 years. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the fear and the doubt and the weight of knowing Sophie's entire future, was riding on decisions he made in the next 72 hours, was something that felt dangerously like hope. Marcus's phone buzzed against his hip at 12:30 in the morning. A text from Margaret Sullivan, the 72-year-old widow who lived next door and sometimes watched Sophie when emergencies arose, though in 3 years he'd never once asked her to stay overnight because being home by 7 a.m. was the one promise he never broke. "Everything okay? Thought I heard you leave again. Need me to check on the little one?" Marcus typed back quickly, thumbs clumsy with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Everything's fine. Might be a long night at work. Can you be on standby in case?" The response came immediately because Margaret never slept well after her husband died, and she'd told Marcus once that knowing someone needed her was the only thing that made insomnia bearable. "Of course, she's lucky to have you. Whatever it is, I hope it's good news." Marcus pocketed his phone and looked at the whiteboard one last time before Victoria returned with her team. At the proof that 13 years hadn't erased who he was, just forced him to become someone else for a while. Someone smaller and quieter and more afraid. His phone rang. Margaret calling now, not texting, which meant she was worried enough to breach the boundary they'd established about late-night contact. "Margaret, I need a favor. A big one." Silence on the other end for 3 heartbeats, then her voice came through clear and certain. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Sophie won't even know you're gone." "I don't know how long—" "Marcus." She cut him off with the gentle firmness of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried a husband who worked himself to death trying to provide. "I raised 4 kids and lost a man who sacrificed everything for his family. I know what opportunity looks like when it knocks once and might not knock again. Go do whatever you need to do." The line went dead before he could thank her, before he could explain, before he could second-guess the choice he was making to trust Sophie's safety to someone else for the first time in years. Victoria appeared in the doorway carrying 2 paper cups of coffee that looked expensive, even empty, the kind from the executive machine that cost more per cup than most people spent on lunch. She set one in front of Marcus without ceremony. "It's terrible." Her voice carried dry humor that felt like a peace offering. "The executive machine costs more per cup than most people spend on lunch, and it still tastes like regret and poor life choices." Marcus almost smiled, the first genuine expression of anything close to happiness in longer than he could remember. "I've had worse." "I doubt that." Victoria sat across from him, exhaustion showing through cracks in her CEO armor. "This coffee is a metaphor for everything wrong with this company. Expensive, overpromised, fundamentally disappointing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Just 2 people sitting in a conference room at 1 in the morning, drinking terrible coffee and trying to figure out how they'd ended up here. 2 strangers from opposite ends of every spectrum that mattered, connected by desperation and the slim chance that desperation might be enough to build something neither could build alone. "Tell me about the system." Marcus set down his cup, met her eyes directly for the first time since this started. "Everything. From the beginning." Victoria pulled up the main architecture on the central screen, and lines of code filled the display. Neural network diagrams, decision tree mappings, the kind of complex AI framework that defense contractors paid fortunes to develop, and militaries paid even larger fortunes to deploy when they worked, and nothing at all when they failed. We promised the Department of Defense an AI that could optimize military logistics in real time. Troop movements, supply chains, resource allocation, all coordinated by a single neural network that learns and adapts faster than any human team could manage under battlefield conditions. Marcus studied the screen, his mind already racing through possibilities, making connections, seeing patterns in the chaos. The caffeine hit his bloodstream, and suddenly he felt more awake than he had in years, neurons firing in sequences he'd forgotten were possible. And it's failing. He could see the problem already, obvious once you knew where to look. But you had to know where to look, and these engineers had been trained to see problems one way, while life had taught Marcus to see them differently. Error rates climbing every iteration. The system can't adapt to unexpected variables. Every time we think we've fixed one problem, 3 more appear like we're fighting a hydra that grows new heads faster than we can cut them off. Victoria's hands clenched around her coffee cup, the only sign of how close she was to breaking. We have until Friday at 2 p.m., 72 hours from now. If we can't demonstrate a working system to General Carter, the contract goes to Meridian Technologies and this company goes under. Not just loses money, goes under completely. 200 employees out of work, my entire legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about overreach, and your daughter's college fund vaporizes along with everything else. Marcus leaned forward, studying the decision tree architecture with the focus of someone who'd spent years solving puzzles in his head because he had no other outlet. The problem was right there, obvious once you knew where to look. There. And there. He pointed without touching the screen, habits from cleaning electronics making him careful. Your engineers built this like a chess program. Every move calculated 17 steps ahead, perfect logic, perfect precision. That's what we hired them for. Victoria's eyebrow rose slightly, the first hint of challenge. That's what $400,000 salaries buy you. That's why it's failing. Marcus grabbed a marker from the table, stood up, moved to the whiteboard where his earlier corrections still glowed under fluorescent lights. His hand was steady now, steadier than it had been in 13 years of pushing mops and emptying trash cans and pretending his brain wasn't screaming at him to solve problems nobody asked him to solve. War isn't chess. Life isn't chess. You can't calculate 17 moves ahead when the board keeps changing, when pieces appear and disappear without warning, when the rules themselves shift mid-game because the enemy doesn't follow your protocols. So what do you suggest? Victoria watched him with the intensity of someone who'd built her career on reading people and knowing when to bet on them against all conventional wisdom. Marcus started writing, the marker moving across the whiteboard with certainty that surprised him, years of knowledge flooding back like a language he'd spoken fluently once and thought he'd forgotten but turned out to just be sleeping. My wife was a social worker. She spent her entire career helping people in crisis, families falling apart, kids in danger, situations where there was no playbook, no protocol, no right answer that would save everyone. Victoria didn't interrupt, just watched him work, and somehow her silence felt more supportive than any encouragement could have been. I asked her once how she made decisions when everything was chaos and she couldn't control any of the variables. You know what she said? What? Marcus stepped back from the whiteboard where he'd drawn a new architecture, organic and adaptive, nothing like the rigid structure on the screens. She said, "You don't try to control chaos. You learn to dance with it. You build systems that are flexible, not rigid. You create frameworks that can bend without breaking, that can adapt instead of shatter." Victoria stared at the whiteboard. her expression unreadable in the way very intelligent people looked when their entire model of reality was being challenged. That's a completely different approach from what we've been trying. Yes, this would require rebuilding the core architecture from scratch. Yes, we have 72 hours. Then we'd better get started. Marcus set down the marker and looked at Victoria with something that might have been confidence, or might have been the desperate bluff of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. She stood, walked to the whiteboard, studied his work with the focus of someone who'd spent 40 years evaluating risks and making bets that could destroy or save everything she'd built. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was quiet now, stripped of the CEO authority, just a human question from one person to another. "You don't owe me anything. You don't owe this company anything. If anything, companies like mine are the reason people like you get overlooked in the first place. Why credentials matter more than competence. Why you've spent 13 years invisible." Marcus thought about Sophie asking him this morning why he looked sad sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. About Catherine's hospital bed and the promise he'd made while holding her hand, feeling it grow weaker every day. About 13 years of being invisible, and one night of someone finally asking him to be seen. When Catherine was dying, she made me promise something. He could still feel her grip, weak but determined, her eyes locked on his like she could will strength into him through force of love alone. She knew I'd have to give up MIT. She knew I'd spend years just surviving instead of living. But she made me promise that when the chance came, really came, not just a fantasy, but an actual door opening, I wouldn't let fear stop me from walking through it. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through because some things needed to be said even when they hurt. She grabbed my hand and said, "Marcus, you're going to want to hide. You're going to tell yourself you're not good enough anymore, that too much time has passed, that the world moved on without you. Promise me you won't believe that. Promise me that when the door opens, you'll walk through it even if you're terrified, even if you think you'll fail, even if it feels safer to stay invisible forever." Victoria's eyes were bright, not crying but close, and Marcus saw in her face that she understood what it meant to make promises to the dead, to carry their hopes when your own had died. "I've been waiting 13 years for a door to open," Marcus continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "Tonight it did. And I made a promise to a woman who deserved better than watching her husband become invisible for the rest of his life, just because she couldn't be there to remind him who he really was." The silence stretched between them, comfortable now instead of tense. Two people who'd both lost things that mattered recognizing each other across the distance. "My husband died 15 years ago." Victoria's voice was steady, but something underneath was breaking, the way ice breaks when spring comes and the thaw reveals everything that was frozen. "Heart attack at his desk, working late for me, for this company. I found him the next morning. His coffee was still warm." Marcus stayed quiet, understanding that some confessions required witness, not response. "Everyone told me to slow down after that, to delegate, to take care of myself before I ended up the same way. But I couldn't, because if I slowed down, I'd have to feel it, have to face what I'd done, what this company cost us, what I sacrificed on the altar of proving everyone wrong about what women my age could accomplish." She turned back to the whiteboard, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So I worked harder, built more, proved everyone wrong who said I couldn't do it alone. And in the process, I became exactly what I was afraid of. Someone who sacrifices everyone she loves for something that can't love her back. It's not too late." The words came out before Marcus could stop them, before he could remember that he was the janitor and she was the CEO, and some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. "Isn't it?" Victoria's laugh was bitter, stripped of everything except pain. My granddaughter barely knows me. My daughter thinks I love this company more than I love her. And maybe she's right. Maybe I do, because at least the company needs me in a way I understand. At least here, I know how to matter. You matter to them too. Marcus spoke with the certainty of someone who'd spent years being the only parent his daughter had, who understood the weight of being needed in ways you couldn't control or predict. They just need you to show up. Not perfect, not with all the answers, just present and trying. Victoria turned the question back on him like a knife, sudden and sharp. When's the last time you showed up? Really showed up as the man you used to be instead of the ghost you've become? The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, had no answer because she was right, and they both knew it. I thought so. Victoria's expression softened slightly, not unkindly, just honest in a way most people weren't brave enough to be. We're both hiding, Marcus. You hide by becoming invisible. I hide by becoming untouchable. But hiding is still hiding, and we're both running out of time to pretend it's working. She moved toward the door, became the CEO again with visible effort. I'm going to get the rest of the team, Beth and Pat and Sarah, the people I actually trust when everything falls apart. We're going to need help to rebuild this architecture in time. Won't they ask questions? Marcus felt the fear creeping back, cold fingers around his spine. About me, about where I came from, about why the janitor is suddenly... They'll ask plenty of questions, but they'll follow my lead because I've earned that trust over years of making the right calls when it mattered. Victoria paused at the threshold, her reflection in the glass making her look simultaneously powerful and fragile. The question is, are you ready to stop being invisible? Marcus thought about Sophie, about 13 years of being furniture in rooms full of people who never looked twice, about what it would mean to matter again and what it would cost if he failed. I don't know if I remember how. Then I guess we'll both be learning something tonight. Victoria left without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, and Marcus stood alone with the whiteboard and his own handwriting, staring back like evidence of a crime, or like proof that he'd once been someone worth remembering. He wasn't sure which scared him more. Wednesday, 8 p.m. Marcus arrived early, 40 minutes before his shift was supposed to start, because sleep had been impossible once the adrenaline wore off and his brain started cataloging everything that could go wrong. The executive floor buzzed with activity. Sarah hunched over her laptop with purple-streaked hair falling in her face. Pat in deep conversation with Beth over a tablet showing code architecture. Victoria pacing near the windows like a caged predator measuring the limits of her enclosure. You're early. Victoria's voice carried surprise. Couldn't sleep. Marcus set his backpack down, the civilian clothes feeling strange after years of gray uniforms. How bad is it? We're close. The integration works, but we need to optimize response times. The system is adapting but not fast enough for real-time military applications where seconds mean the difference between soldiers coming home or coming home in boxes. Show me. Marcus moved to Sarah's workstation, falling into rhythm like he'd never left. Like 13 years was nothing, like he belonged here among people who understood that code was just another language for describing how the world worked when you stripped away everything except logic and consequence. Pat approached with her tablet, eyes studying him with the frank assessment of someone who'd spent 30 years in an industry that chewed up and spit out anyone who couldn't prove their worth every single day. You want to replace linear regression with sigmoid function? That goes against 10 years of research and best practices that smarter people than both of us developed. Marcus didn't look up from the screen, hands already flying across Sarah's keyboard with muscle memory taking over. I know it sounds crazy. I didn't say crazy. Pat cut him off, not unkindly. I said unconventional. There's a difference. Crazy is doing the same thing expecting different results. Unconventional is trying something new because the conventional approach already failed. She pulled up a chair next to Marcus, settling in with the comfort of someone who'd learned to trust her instincts about people. Explain it to me. Not with math. I can read the equations myself. I want to know why. What makes you think this will work when everything else didn't? Marcus leaned back, looked at the whiteboard still covered in his corrections from hours ago, thought about how to translate 13 years of survival into language that made sense to people who'd never had to choose between eating and paying rent. My wife was a social worker. She spent her entire career helping people in crisis. Families falling apart, kids in danger, situations with no playbook and no right answers. He could feel everyone's attention shifting to him. Sarah pulling off her headphones. Beth stopping mid-phone call. I asked her once how she made decisions when everything was chaos. You know what she said? What? Sarah's voice was eager, young, full of the kind of enthusiasm Marcus remembered from his own MIT days before the world taught him that enthusiasm wasn't enough. She said, "You don't try to control chaos. You learn to dance with it. You build systems that are flexible, not rigid. You create frameworks that can bend without breaking, because the second you try to impose perfect order on inherently messy systems, you've already lost." He stood, moved to the whiteboard, picked up a marker. That's the problem with linear regression. It assumes straight lines, predictable patterns, futures that follow the past. But war doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. Reality is curves, not lines. It's adaptation, not prediction. Pat stood too, approaching the board with her eyes lighting up in the way very intelligent people looked when they saw old problems from completely new angles. So sigmoid function gives us the flexibility to bend with unexpected variables without losing structural integrity. Exactly. Marcus drew more, the architecture taking shape under his hands. And if we redistribute the weighted nodes across the temporal axis, we account for the fact that recent data matters more than old data, that systems learn and evolve, and yesterday's patterns might not apply tomorrow. Pat was nodding now, fingers already flying over her tablet. That's actually brilliant in its simplicity. It's survival. Marcus didn't look up, kept writing, kept building. When Sophie was 2 years old, she had tantrums every single day. I couldn't respond to every scream like it was an emergency. I had to learn to tell the difference between "I want a cookie" and "I'm actually hurt." Same principle. Teaching the system to recognize signal versus noise, to weight information based on relevance instead of treating everything as equally important. Sarah wiped her eyes, not even trying to hide the tears. That's actually beautiful. Language, Sarah. Beth's voice held gentle reproach, but she was smiling. Sorry, but seriously. Sarah turned back to her screen, energy renewed. If we apply this principle across the entire architecture, her fingers flew across the keyboard, code appearing faster than Marcus could track. Pat joined her, the two of them working in tandem while Marcus watched and corrected and guided, feeling something shift in the room. Not him teaching them, but all of them collaborating. Equals. 10:30 p.m. The work blurred into rhythm Marcus had forgotten was possible, his hands flying across keyboards that felt foreign and familiar at the same time, muscle memory returning, brain patterns reactivating, like a language he'd once spoken fluently and thought he'd lost but turned out to be just sleeping, waiting for someone to ask him to speak again. Victoria stood near the windows, phone constantly buzzing with messages she ignored, but her eyes kept drifting back to Marcus. The way he explained concepts with patience and clarity. The way he listened when Sarah talked, really listened instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. The way he remembered to bring Pat coffee exactly how she liked it without being asked. Small things, Things Robert used to do 20 years ago before work consumed everything, before the company became more important than the person building it. Things she'd thought died with him, but maybe had just been waiting for someone else to remember they mattered. Beth approached, voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. "He's a good one." Victoria startled. "What?" "Marcus. He's a good person. The kind that's rare enough you notice when you find one." "Beth? When's the last time you looked at a man and didn't immediately categorize him as employee or competitor or threat?" Beth's voice held gentle challenge, 18 years of friendship giving her permission to push. "When's the last time you saw someone as just human?" Victoria didn't answer because there was no good answer, because Beth was right and they both knew it. "I've known you 18 years, Beth continued, relentless in the way of people who loved you enough to tell uncomfortable truths. "I've seen how you look at him. It's not the way you look at Crawford or Blake or any other man in this building. It's different." "He's 52. I'm 61. He's an employee. He's 9 years younger. Robert was 12 years older than you and nobody blinked. And after this week, he'll be a colleague, not an employee, assuming we all survive long enough to see Friday." Beth touched Victoria's arm lightly, a gesture of comfort she rarely allowed herself. "I'm not saying you have to do anything. Just don't dismiss it because you're afraid. You've spent 15 years afraid of feeling anything, and look where it got you." She walked away before Victoria could respond, leaving her alone with thoughts she'd been avoiding and a growing awareness that maybe surviving wasn't the same as living, that maybe there was a difference between being strong and being armored. 11:15 p.m., Marcus appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and she noticed for the first time that he'd learned which kind she preferred without anyone telling him, the way observant people learned things by paying attention instead of asking. "Thought you might need this. The machine is still terrible, but it's caffeinated, and that's what matters at this point." Victoria accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly, and felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. A spark of connection that had nothing to do with business or strategy, or any of the carefully controlled relationships that defined her life. They stood side by side, looking out at Seattle glittering below them, the city full of people living lives she'd forgotten how to live. "You don't have to stay." Marcus's voice was gentle, not presumptuous. "Beth and the team can handle things from here. You should go home. Sleep. See Lily tomorrow instead of promising next weekend again." "I can't stop. If I stop, I have to think." "Think about what?" Victoria surprised herself by answering honestly, the exhaustion and the coffee and something about Marcus making her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "About what I've lost, about what I've sacrificed. About the fact that Lily is 8 years old and I've missed 3 years of her life because I was too busy proving something that doesn't matter nearly as much as I've pretended it does." Her voice cracked and she hated herself for it, for showing weakness, for being human when being human meant feeling things she'd spent decades learning to suppress. "About the fact that my daughter thinks I love this company more than I love her. And maybe she's right. Maybe I do, because at least here I know how to matter. At least here my value is measurable in quarterly reports and market share instead of messy, complicated feelings I don't know how to handle." Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, being present in a way most people weren't capable of. The kind of presence that came from years of sitting with Sophie through nightmares and homework meltdowns and all the small crises that couldn't be solved, only witnessed. "How old did you say Lily was?" 8. Same as Sophie. Then it's not too late. 8-year-olds forgive everything if you show up and mean it. Sophie teaches me that every day, that kids don't need perfect, they just need present. They just need you to try. Victoria turned to look at him, Really look at this man who cleaned toilets for people who didn't know his name and somehow maintained more humanity than she'd managed in 40 years of corner offices. How do you do it? Alone. 13 years. How do you not break? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it, just recognition of pain. Who says I don't break? I break every day. Break when Sophie asks why other kids have moms and she doesn't. Break when I'm too tired to play but she needs me anyway. Break when I see other fathers and think I'm not enough. Will never be enough. Can't give her what she deserves. His voice softened. But I learned that breaking isn't the end. It's just what happens to things under pressure. And if you break in the right way, with the right people around you, the cracks let light in instead of letting everything drain out. Victoria looked at this man. Janitor in worn jeans and a faded shirt. Gray hair he probably cut himself to save money. Hands calloused from work that left marks. And saw more than she'd seen in anyone in 15 years. Saw someone who understood loneliness because he'd lived in it. Saw someone who'd lost everything that mattered and somehow found a way to keep going anyway. Marcus, she started, but didn't know how to finish, didn't have words for what she was feeling. Victoria! Sarah's shout cut through the moment like scissors through thread. Integration passed. System is stable. The moment shattered. But something had shifted between them, something fragile and new and terrifying in its possibility. Thursday, 2:30 a.m. Error cascaded across every monitor like dominoes falling, red warnings screaming failure in a dozen different ways simultaneously. The integration test collapsed catastrophically, everything they'd built in the last 6 hours crumbling under its own weight. Sarah's face went pale, the color draining so fast Marcus thought she might faint. No. No, no, no. Pat pulled up diagnostics, fingers flying faster than seemed humanly possible. Error propagating through the neural network. Feedback loop corrupting the weighted nodes. We're losing structural integrity across all primary systems. Beth's phone rang, and she answered with hands that shook slightly. General Carter's office. They're confirming the demonstration for 10 a.m. They're en route from Washington. She hung up, looked at the team with fear showing through her professional mask. We have 7.5 hours. Victoria stopped pacing, stood completely still, and for the first time since this started, her CEO armor cracked completely. We're done. No. Marcus's voice cut through the panic, calm in a way that made everyone turn to look at him. The kind of calm that came from sitting with Catherine at 3 a.m. while she screamed in pain and Sophie cried because she was 6 months old and didn't understand why Mommy hurt. The kind of calm that came from choosing between groceries and electricity and learning to make impossible decisions without falling apart. He walked to the main screen, studied the error patterns, let his mind work the way it used to when problems were puzzles instead of life or death stakes. 90 seconds of perfect silence while everyone else held their breath. There. Subsection 47. Pat pulled up the code, frowning. I don't see. We're overweighting temporal data in chaos scenarios. The system is trying to learn from pure randomness, from noise instead of signal. You can't learn from random. You can only accept it and filter it out so it doesn't corrupt everything else. He turned to Pat, meeting her eyes directly. Pull up the node distribution matrix. She did. Marcus pointed to a specific section, his certainty absolute in a way it hadn't been since before Catherine died and the world stopped making sense. Here, we're telling the system that all data is equally valuable, but in chaos, some data is noise masquerading as signal. We need to teach it to recognize the difference, statistical variance thresholds. If a data point falls outside 2 standard deviations, weight it lower. Don't ignore it completely because it might be a genuinely important outlier, but don't let it dominate the learning process either. Pat's eyes widened as understanding crystallized. It's survival. Marcus was already typing, fingers flying across keys he'd barely touched in 13 years. When Sophie was 2, she had tantrums every day. I couldn't respond to every scream like it was an emergency, or I'd never sleep, never eat, never function. I had to learn to distinguish between "I want a cookie" and "I'm genuinely hurt and need help right now." Same principle. Sarah and Pat joined him, following his lead, and for 12 minutes, the only sound was keyboards clicking and code restructuring, and 3 people working together to solve a problem that had destroyed 20 PhDs. "Run the test." Pat's voice was tight with tension. The screen processed, calculated. Every second felt like an hour. Every heartbeat loud enough to echo. The display flashed green. Every metric perfect. Better than perfect. The system wasn't just stable. It was thriving in ways their original architecture never could have achieved. Sarah let out a whoop loud enough to wake people on lower floors. "It works! The core framework actually works!" Beth laughed, high and relieved, the sound of someone who'd been holding their breath for 3 days. Finally exhaling. Pat leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Victoria walked to the screen, hands shaking as she gripped the back of Sarah's chair. Her face showed nothing. But Marcus saw her hands, saw the way she held on like letting go would mean falling, like this moment was the only thing keeping her from collapse. Run full stress test. All scenarios. Military operations, supply chain disruptions, multivariable chaos. Everything we promised and everything we were afraid to promise. Sarah's fingers flew and the system calculated, processed, adapted in real time while they watched. Green metrics filled every screen. Performance numbers that made Beth whistle low. Error reduction 68%. Sarah's voice cracked. "That's better than this morning's test." Processing speed increase 47%. Adaptation to unexpected variables. Sarah paused, read the number again like she couldn't believe it. Increase 320%. Pat leaned forward, disbelief written across her face. "Run it again. That can't possibly. 320%. Sarah's voice was firm now, certain. "I ran it 3 times. Same result every time." Silence fell, heavy with the weight of what they'd accomplished, what it meant, what it changed. Marcus stared at screens showing proof that 13 years of survival hadn't erased who he was, that knowledge didn't die just because you couldn't use it, that maybe, just maybe, he could give Sophie something better than a father who came home exhausted every morning, smelling like cleaning chemicals and broken dreams. His phone alarm went off. 6:45 a.m. 15 minutes to get home before Sophie woke up, before his carefully constructed routine shattered and she found out her father had spent the night doing something that might fail spectacularly and break both their hearts. "I have to go." Marcus stood fast enough to make his chair roll backward. "Sophie wakes up at 7. I promised I'd be there." Sarah's head snapped around. "The system isn't finished. We still need to optimize." "My daughter is waking up. I promised I'd be there when she opens her eyes. That's not negotiable." Victoria stood, something shifting in her expression. "Go. We'll continue without you." "But Victoria, I spent 40 years choosing work over the people who matter." Her voice was firm, but underneath it something softer, something that understood. "Don't make my mistakes. Go home. Be with Sophie. Come back tonight if you want, but right now she needs you more than this system does." Marcus hesitated at the door, every instinct screaming that leaving now meant abandoning them, that he needed to stay and finish what he'd started. But the larger part, the part that had kept him going through 13 years of exhaustion, knew Sophie needed him more than algorithms ever would. "Thank you for seeing me, for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, transforming her face in a way that made her look younger and more human. Thank you for reminding me what chances are for. Now go, before you're late and I have to explain to an 8-year-old why her father broke his promise. Marcus burst through his apartment door at 6:57, stripped off his shirt while running to the bathroom, shoved everything under the sink where Sophie wouldn't find evidence of the life he was trying to build beyond these walls. Cold water on his face, jeans and t-shirt pulled on with hands that still trembled from adrenaline and caffeine, and the surreal understanding that he'd spent 9 hours doing work he loved more than anything except his daughter. Sophie sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas, already awake, drawing something with purple crayon on construction paper. She looked up when he entered, and her smile hit him like it did every morning, pure and trusting, and completely undeserved. "Bah, you look tired." Marcus knelt beside her, pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual because he needed it more than she did. "Just a long night, Butterfly. How'd you sleep?" "Good. Mrs. Sullivan said you were helping someone important." Sophie studied his face with uncomfortable perceptiveness, the way she sometimes looked at him like she could see through all his careful pretending. "Was it the sad princess?" Marcus's brain stuttered. "What sad princess?" "From your stories. The one who forgot how to smile because she built her castle too high and couldn't remember how to come down." He'd told Sophie that story 6 months ago when she asked why some people had big houses but looked unhappy, and apparently she remembered everything, filed it away, connected dots he didn't realize he was drawing. "Yeah, Butterfly. Something like that. You'll help her remember. You always help people. That's your superpower." Marcus's throat closed around words he couldn't say, so he just held her tighter and hoped it was enough. They made pancakes together, Sophie measuring flour with careful concentration while Marcus worked the griddle on autopilot, his mind half in the kitchen and half still at Nexus Technologies, watching green numbers fill screens where red ones had been. "Ba, can I ask you something?" "Always." Sophie set down the spatula, looked at him with an expression too old for her face, too knowing for 8 years of life. "If you had a chance to do something different, something bigger, but it might change things, would you?" The question hit harder than it should have, coming from someone who couldn't possibly understand what she was asking, but somehow asked it anyway. "What kind of different?" "I don't know. Like maybe a different job, maybe working different hours sometimes." Sophie flipped a pancake with intense focus, not meeting his eyes. "Would you be okay if things changed a little?" Marcus crouched beside the stove so they were eye level, needing her to see his face when he said this. "Would you be okay if I wasn't always home exactly at 7? Her voice came out small, vulnerable in a way that made him want to promise impossible things. "Would you still come home in the mornings?" "I'd try. I'd always try." He touched her cheek gently. "But I need you to know something, Butterfly. Whatever changes, I love you more than anything, more than any job, more than any person, more than anything in this whole world." Sophie was quiet for a moment, and he could see her processing, thinking through implications with the seriousness of a child who'd learned too young that nothing was guaranteed. "Ba? Molly said her dad makes lots of money, and that's why he's important. But Mrs. Peterson said that's not how you measure people. She said you measure people by how they make other people feel." She paused, choosing words with care. "So if this different thing makes you feel good, then you should do it. Because when you feel good, I feel good. That's how it works." Marcus pulled her into a hug that lifted her off the step stool, breathing in strawberry shampoo and the innocence of a child who still believed her father could fix anything if he just tried hard enough. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm practicing." Sophie giggled, the sound like bells, like hope, like everything worth fighting for. They finished pancakes together. Sophie chattered about her upcoming field trip to the Science Museum, about how she hoped they'd see the dinosaur bones because dinosaurs were the coolest thing ever, except maybe space. Marcus walked her to the bus stop at 8:15, watched her climb aboard with her too heavy backpack covered in stickers, waved until the bus disappeared around the corner, then stood alone on the sidewalk feeling the weight of everything pressing down, the choice he was making, the risk he was taking, the fragile stability he might be destroying for a chance at something better or something that would prove he'd been right to stay invisible all along. His phone buzzed. Victoria. Board meeting moved. Thursday, 8:45 a.m. instead of Friday. Crawford knows. Blake called emergency session. We have 45 minutes. Marcus's stomach dropped into his shoes, the world tilting sideways. Not Friday afternoon. Thursday morning. Less than an hour from now. He typed back with numb fingers. I'll be there. Another text came through immediately. Wear the suit from executive shop floor 5. And Marcus, whatever happens, you changed something. That matters. Thursday, 8:30 a.m. Marcus stood outside the boardroom doors in a borrowed shirt and tie that felt like costume jewelry, like he was a child playing dress-up in his father's closet, pretending to be someone important enough to belong in rooms where decisions got made that affected hundreds of lives. Victoria stood beside him, perfectly composed on the surface, CEO armor locked in place. But Marcus had learned to read the micro-expressions that leaked through, the way her jaw tightened, how her left hand opened and closed against her thigh. She was terrified, just better at hiding it. Ready? No. Marcus forced himself to meet her eyes. Are you? Not even a little. Victoria's mouth quirked in something between a smile and a grimace. But we're doing it anyway. She paused, and something in her expression softened. Whatever happens in there, you proved something. You proved you were never invisible. You were just waiting to be seen. And I saw you. That counts for something, even if everything else falls apart. That doesn't pay rent when I'm unemployed and blacklisted. Then we'd better make sure you're not unemployed. Victoria pushed the doors open, and 12 faces turned to stare. Board members arranged around the massive mahogany table like judges at a trial, like executioners measuring the condemned. Thomas Blake sat at the head, already claiming territory that wasn't his, silver hair and expensive suit and the kind of confidence that came from spending a lifetime accumulating power and knowing exactly how to wield it. Dr. Crawford occupied the seat to Blake's right, satisfaction radiating from him like heat. 23 years of credentials and published papers and professional respect, all threatened by a janitor who'd solved problems Crawford couldn't, the ego wound festering for days. And at the far end of the table, arrival unannounced and completely unexpected, sat General William Carter in full dress uniform. 60 years old, ramrod posture, eyes that had seen combat and death and knew how to calculate the cost of failure in human lives instead of quarterly earnings. Marcus's feet stopped moving. Carter wasn't supposed to be here. The demonstration was scheduled for 10 a.m. It was only 8:45. Someone had changed the timeline again, orchestrated an ambush. General Carter. Victoria recovered first, voice steady despite the surprise. We weren't expecting you until I moved my schedule. Carter's voice cut through the room like a blade through tissue, each word precise and measured. Mr. Blake was kind enough to inform me there might be irregularities with this project. I wanted to see for myself before committing $100 million to something built on questionable foundations. Thomas Blake stood, spreading his hands in a gesture of false humility that made Marcus's stomach turn. General, I apologize that you had to learn about this situation in such an unfortunate manner. If I'd known earlier about Ms. Hastings' lapse in judgment regarding personnel decisions, I would have— What lapse would that be, Mr. Blake? Victoria hired an unqualified individual to work on your contract. A man with no security clearance, no credentials, no background in artificial intelligence research. Blake picked up a folder from the table, opened it with theatrical precision. A man who works as a janitor. Gasps rippled around the table. One board member's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Another exchanged glances with her neighbor, eyebrows rising. I see. Carter's gaze shifted to Marcus, predator assessing prey, calculating threat levels and potential value in the span of a heartbeat. And who is this unqualified individual? Marcus stepped forward before Victoria could speak, before he could talk himself out of it, before fear won. That would be me, sir. Marcus Webb. His voice came out steady, hands didn't shake. 13 years of being invisible training him to control his body when his mind screamed. And what are your qualifications, Mr. Webb? The question wrapped in professional courtesy, but underneath was steel, the weight of authority that came from 4 decades commanding soldiers, making life or death decisions, living with consequences. I was 2 semesters away from a PhD at MIT before I dropped out 13 years ago. Since then, I've been working as a night janitor at this company. The room went silent. Complete. Absolute. The kind of silence that preceded earthquakes. Crawford's smile widened. Blake's expression shifted to satisfied vindication. Board members leaned forward with the hungry attention of people watching a public execution. A janitor. Carter's tone gave away nothing. Neutral as Switzerland, dangerous as a minefield. You're telling me a janitor has been working on a classified defense contract? Yes, sir. Blake jumped in, voice dripping false concern like honey laced with arsenic. You see, General, this is exactly what I was warning you about. Victoria's judgment has been compromised. She's making emotional decisions instead of, I didn't ask you, Mr. Blake. Carter didn't even look at him, attention staying locked on Marcus with laser focus. One more interruption and you'll wait outside. Blake's face reddened, but he sat down hard, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Carter turned back to Marcus, expression unreadable as stone. Mr. Webb, I want you to explain to me in plain English what you did to this system. No jargon, no technical specifications, just simple language a combat officer can understand. Marcus's throat went dry, every instinct screaming to defer, to let someone more qualified speak, to become invisible again because being seen meant being vulnerable to judgment. But then he thought about Sophie asking if the sad princess learned to smile again, about Catherine's hand gripping his, about 13 years of survival and one chance to prove it hadn't destroyed who he was. Sir, your engineers built a perfect system. Every protocol followed, every parameter optimized, every calculation it executed with precision. Marcus heard his voice growing stronger, muscle memory of presenting research kicking in. And that's the problem. Carter leaned forward slightly. Explain. It's a problem because war isn't perfect. Life isn't perfect. Your system was designed to predict the future based on past patterns, to calculate 17 moves ahead like a chess grandmaster. But the future doesn't follow patterns. It breaks them. And the second you try to impose perfect order on inherently chaotic systems, you've already lost. Blake scoffed, unable to help himself. General, this is exactly the kind of unscientific— Mr. Blake. Carter's voice dropped to a tone that could freeze blood, could stop hearts, could end careers. One more interruption, and you'll not only wait outside, you'll wait in your car. Am I clear? Blake's mouth snapped shut. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Marcus continued, gaining momentum, feeling the room shift. I redesigned the core architecture to adapt instead of predict, to learn from chaos instead of trying to control it, to think like a field commander when the plan falls apart and all you have left is training and instinct and the will to keep going. Those are nice words, Mr. Webb. Carter's expression remained unreadable, giving Marcus nothing to work with. Can you prove them? Yes, sir. Marcus looked at Victoria. She nodded once, trust and terror mixing in her eyes. Sarah was already setting up the presentation screen, laptop connected, fingers flying with the efficiency of someone who knew every second counted. "General, if you'll allow us to demonstrate," Victoria began. "Not you, Ms. Hastings." Carter held up one hand, stopping her cold. "Him. I want to see what the janitor can do." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a dare, like everything Marcus had feared and hoped for crystallizing in one impossible moment. Marcus walked to the presentation screen, hands trembling, voice steady. The borrowed tie felt like a noose, shirt collar too tight, but he'd learned 13 years ago how to function when terrified, how to show up when showing up was the hardest thing you'd ever done. "Sarah, pull up the Kandahar simulation." Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Professional, competent, giving him tools but unable to help beyond that because this was his test, his moment, his chance to matter or fail spectacularly in front of people who would remember either way. The scenario appeared on screen: maps, troop positions, supply routes marked in red and green, the visual representation of a real-world failure that had cost lives. "This is a real-world logistics failure from 2023. Multiple supply lines compromised, enemy movement in civilian areas, equipment failures cascading across 3 separate units." Marcus forced himself to speak with confidence he didn't feel, projecting certainty like armor. "The original mission took 3 weeks and cost 11 soldiers their lives." General Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in his professional mask. He knew this mission, had probably signed the casualty reports, maybe attended some of those funerals. "Run it through your old system." Sarah input the parameters. The screen calculated for 8 seconds that felt like 8 hours, then displayed an error message in stark red letters. "No viable route found within acceptable risk parameters." That's what your original AI produced. A system that couldn't find solutions because it was optimized for perfection instead of reality, for chess when it needed to be jazz. Marcus met Carter's eyes directly, refusing to look away. "Now watch this." He input the same scenario into their rebuilt system, the one he and Sarah and Pat had spent 3 nights creating, the one that represented every ounce of knowledge he'd preserved through 13 years of survival. 3 seconds later, 3 alternative routes appeared, ranked by risk-time resource efficiency. Route Alpha avoids the main conflict zone entirely by rerouting through the northern corridor. Estimated delivery time 14 hours. Casualty risk minimal. The northern corridor was mined. Carter's voice was flat. Statement of fact, not question. Testing whether Marcus had done his homework or was bluffing. "The system accounts for that. Look here," Marcus pulled up detailed analysis, showing Sarah where to zoom. It detected anomalies in the terrain data, flagged potential IED placement, suggested reconnaissance drone sweep before convoy movement. He paused for effect. Nobody in the original mission thought of that. Carter stood slowly, walked toward the screen with measured pace, the walk of someone whose decisions determined whether soldiers came home alive or in boxes. He studied the routes, the numbers, the analysis, processing faster than most people could read. Nobody in the original mission could process that much data fast enough. "The system did it in 3 seconds, sir." The room was absolutely silent. Board members staring at the screen like it was showing them the future. Blake's expression shifting from triumph to uncertainty. Crawford looking like he'd been punched in the stomach. Carter turned from the screen, face still unreadable. "Run another scenario. Something your team hasn't prepared for. Something I create right now." Blake tried one more time, desperation creeping into his voice. "General, surely that's not necessary. The point has been made about protocol violations." "The point, Mr. Blake, is whether this system can save American lives. Carter's words could cut steel, could end arguments, could change everything. I don't care who built it. I don't care about credentials or protocols or the way things are supposed to work when the way things are supposed to work has already failed. I care if it works. He turned back to Marcus, and something in his eyes shifted. Not warmth exactly, but interest, respect. Hurricane evacuation, Gulf Coast, 3 military bases, 12,000 personnel, limited air transport, deteriorating weather window. You have 30 seconds to input the scenario. Marcus's fingers flew across the keyboard. No time to think, no time to doubt, just muscle memory and instinct and the desperation of a man who had everything riding on the next 90 seconds. Heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Sweat down his spine, but hands steady. Sophie's face flashed through his mind. At school right now, third period, reading probably, trusting that her father was doing something important, trusting that he wouldn't let her down the way the world had let them both down when Catherine died. The system processed, calculated, adapted in real time. Marcus breathed, then explained rapidly, words tumbling out faster than he could fully process them. Primary evacuation route uses naval vessels from Pensacola. Secondary route coordinates helicopter transport in rotation to minimize weather exposure. Tertiary route establishes temporary shelters at inland facilities if transport becomes impossible. Time frame. Carter's voice was sharp as glass. All 12,000 personnel evacuated within 18 hours. The system accounts for real-time weather data, equipment availability, personnel readiness across all 3 bases. Carter's eyebrows rose fractionally, first real break in his professional mask. Standard military protocol takes 36 hours for that evacuation. Standard protocol doesn't account for real-time weather adaptation, sir. Marcus felt something clicking into place, certainty that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with knowing he was right. This system does. He pulled up another screen, showing adaptive algorithms working in real time. Watch here. System continuously recalculates based on weather changes. If the hurricane shifts 10 degrees north, Marcus input the change. System instantly adjusted routes, priorities flipping, what was tertiary becoming primary, seamless adaptation without human intervention. Route priorities flip automatically, no human intervention needed, no delay, just adaptation to changing reality. Like people. Carter's voice was quiet now, thoughtful, dangerous in a different way. Like people who survived. Marcus corrected gently, meeting the general's eyes. Like people who learned to think in chaos because chaos was all they had. Like soldiers when the plan falls apart and all you've got is training and instinct and the refusal to quit. Carter was silent for a long moment, and Marcus felt the weight of 40 years of command pressing down through that silence, evaluating, calculating, deciding. Then the general spoke, voice carrying weight that made everyone in the room sit straighter. Mr. Webb, why did you drop out of MIT? The question hung in the air, shifted from professional to personal, from credentials to character. Marcus saw Victoria move forward slightly, protective, ready to defend. But he raised his hand, stopping her. This was his story, his truth, his right to tell. My wife was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, sir. We had a newborn daughter. No insurance. Medical debt like mountains we'd never climb. Carter didn't interrupt, just listened with the complete attention he probably gave intelligence briefings, focus that made you feel like the only person in the world. So, I made a choice. I could stay in school and let someone else hold my wife's hand while she died, or I could drop out and be there for every single moment we had left. Marcus swallowed hard, forced the words out. I dropped out 2 semesters before finishing. Took care of Catherine for 18 months. held her hand through every chemo session, every radiation treatment, every night when the pain got so bad she couldn't sleep, and all I could do was lie next to her and promise our daughter would be okay, even though I had no idea how to make that promise true. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. Then I held Sophie at Catherine's funeral and promised I'd do whatever it took to give her a good life, even if it meant cleaning toilets for people who look through me like I'm invisible, even if it meant giving up everything I'd worked for, even if it meant burying who I used to be under who I had to become. Final words came out barely above a whisper. Because she's worth more than any PhD, worth more than any career, worth more than pride. How old is your daughter? Carter's voice was softer now, almost gentle. 8, sir. Same as Miss Hastings' granddaughter. Victoria went very still, and Marcus knew he'd just revealed something she hadn't shared, something private, but it was too late to take back. Carter walked toward Marcus, stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Marcus could see the ribbons on his uniform, years of service, weight of responsibility, lives lost and saved. Mr. Webb, I've commanded soldiers for 40 years. You know what kills soldiers? Blake started to speak, but Carter's glance silenced him like a physical blow. Not lack of training, not lack of equipment, not even enemy fire most of the time. Carter's voice carried the weight of experience, of funerals attended, of letters written to families. What kills soldiers is rigid thinking, systems that can't adapt, leaders who care more about rules than results, more about protocols than people. He met Marcus's eyes. People who can't see the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. Carter turned to Blake. You called me here to report irregularities, protocol violations. Back to Marcus. You know what I see instead? Marcus didn't trust his voice, just shook his head. I see a man who rebuilt himself from nothing, who chose family over ambition and somehow found a way to combine both, who taught a computer to think like a human instead of expecting humans to think like computers. Carter's voice strengthened. I see exactly the kind of person I want building systems that soldiers depend on. Someone who knows what matters because they've lost everything and kept going anyway. He extended his hand. Marcus shook it, grip firm, steady, the handshake of two people who understood sacrifice. Your daughter is lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, sir. I can tell. That's why you'll be good at this job. Because you know what matters beyond the metrics and the protocols and all the things we measure that don't actually measure anything important. Carter turned to face the full board, voice carrying authority that filled every corner of the room. I'm approving the contract. Full funding. $100 million. Board members started to relax, started to smile, tension draining like water. Blake half rose from his chair, mouth opening. And I'm adding a condition. Carter's voice stopped all movement, all breath, all hope and fear crystallizing into one moment. Victoria stepped forward. What condition, General? Mr. Webb leads the implementation team. Full security clearance, full compensation, full recognition. Carter paused, letting the words land. His title will be Lead Systems Architect, reporting directly to Ms. Hastings. You can't be serious. Blake surged to his feet, face red, control slipping. The board has final say on personnel decisions. This is highly, then the board can find another $100 million contract. Carter's voice became steel wrapped in courtesy, velvet over iron. This system saves lives. Mr. Webb built it. Either he leads it or I walk. And I'll make sure every branch of the military knows exactly why I walked away from a billion-dollar company that cared more about credentials than capability. Pause. Let the ultimatum sink in. let Blake understand he'd already lost. Your choice, Mr. Blake, but choose quickly because my time is valuable and I don't waste it on people who can't see talent when it solves their problems right in front of them. The chairwoman, an older woman Marcus had barely noticed before, stood with the authority of someone who'd learned when to let chaos run and when to impose order. We'll vote. All in favor of accepting General Carter's terms, including the appointment of Marcus Webb as lead systems architect. Hands went up. Marcus counted through fog, through disbelief, through the surreal understanding that his life was changing in ways he couldn't fully process. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, all opposed. Blake's hand, Crawford's, one other board member who looked uncomfortable but committed. Motion carries 9-3. The chairwoman looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect. Congratulations, Mr. Webb. Welcome to Nexus Technologies. Officially this time. Blake stormed out without a word, footsteps echoing like gunshots. Crawford followed, defeated, the weight of failure visible in every line of his body. The remaining board members approached to shake Marcus's hand, welcome him, pretend they hadn't just watched him almost get destroyed. Beth was crying quietly, Sarah hugging Pat, Victoria standing by the windows, back to the room, shoulders shaking. General Carter approached one final time, the room giving him space, understanding this was private. Mr. Webb. Yes, sir. I meant what I said. The best leaders aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up, who know that breaking isn't the end, just part of the process of becoming stronger in the broken places. He paused, and something in his eyes softened. Your daughter is lucky, and she'll be even luckier when she's old enough to understand what you sacrificed, what you preserved, what you became in the space between losing everything and finding yourself again. Thank you, sir, for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. I spent 40 years learning that the most important people are usually the ones nobody's looking at. You reminded me why that matters, why credentials are just paper and character is everything. Carter smiled, transformation that made him look 10 years younger. Good luck, Mr. Webb, and enjoy the time with Sophie. These years don't come back, and you can't buy them with any amount of success. They shook hands one final time. Then Carter turned, walked out with the same measured pace he'd entered, leaving Marcus standing in a boardroom that felt too small for everything that had just changed. Thursday, 10:15 a.m. Marcus stood outside Jefferson Elementary, heart pounding, hands shaking. Not from fear anymore. From something else, something bigger, something like joy or hope or feelings he'd forgotten existed beneath the weight of survival. The receptionist recognized him from PTA meetings, looked concerned when he showed up mid-morning on a school day. Mr. Webb, is everything okay? Is Sophie? Everything's fine. Better than fine. Marcus heard how that sounded, how desperate, how unhinged, but couldn't stop the words. I just need to see her. Please, it can't wait. Something in his face made her smile instead of call security. Let me get Mrs. Peterson. 5 minutes later, Sophie came down the hallway holding her teacher's hand, confusion on her face turning to worry when she saw her father. Bah, what's wrong? Why are you here? Marcus knelt in the school hallway, other kids passing by, teachers watching, not caring about any of it. Nothing's wrong, Butterfly. Everything's right. Everything's finally right. Then why are you crying? Happy tears. He pulled her close, breathing in strawberry shampoo and childhood. I did it. I helped the princess remember how to smile. Sophie pulled back, studied him with those eyes too knowing for 8 years. You did it? You helped her? We helped each other. Marcus wiped his eyes, not even trying to hide the tears. And Butterfly, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. Mrs. Peterson appeared, mid-50s, kind face, the expression of a teacher who'd seen enough of life to recognize significant moments. Mr. Webb, is Sophie okay? She's perfect, and I'm sorry to interrupt class, but I needed to tell her something that couldn't wait another second. Mrs. Peterson smiled, the smile of someone who understood. Sometimes the best lessons happen outside the classroom. Sophie, why don't you take a few minutes with your dad? Come back when you're ready. They sat on a bench outside the school, morning sun warm on their faces, Seattle waking up around them while Marcus's world tilted into something new. Sophie waited with the patience of a child who'd learned her father didn't rush important things. You know how I work nights at that big company? How I clean the offices? Sophie nodded, completely focused. Well, before you were born, before I met Mommy, I was studying to be a scientist at a very good school called MIT. I was going to build computers that could help people and change the world, do important work. Sophie's eyes went wide. You were going to be a scientist? Like for real? Like for real. Marcus smiled through tears. But then Mommy got sick and I had to make a choice. I could stay in school and finish, or I could drop out and take care of her. Take care of you. You chose Mommy. Sophie's voice was certain, no question, just understanding. I chose both of you, and I thought that meant giving up being a scientist forever. Thought I'd used up my one chance and that was it. He squeezed her hand. But I was wrong, Butterfly. Last night, the company offered me a new job. Not cleaning floors, building things, important things. They want me to be a scientist again. I knew it! Sophie threw her arms around his neck. I knew you were special. I told Molly's dad you were the smartest person in the whole world and he didn't believe me, but I knew. She pulled back, grinning wide enough to split her face. Wait till I tell Mrs. Peterson. Wait till I tell everyone. When did you get so smart? Good genes. Mommy was smart and you're smart, so I'm double smart. Sophie delivered it with perfect 8-year-old seriousness, and Marcus laughed for the first time in longer than he could remember, real laughter that came from joy instead of politeness. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then her voice came out small. Bah, do you think Mommy knows about today? Marcus's chest seized. He pulled her into his lap, held tight. Yeah, Butterfly, I think Mommy knows, and I think she's very proud of both of us. Proud of you for being so brave and smart and kind. Proud of me for finally walking through the door when it opened. Me too. Sophie hugged back. Can I go tell my class now? Can I tell them you're a scientist? You can tell them whatever you want, even the part about cleaning toilets, because there's nothing wrong with any work that lets you take care of people you love. That's what Mrs. Peterson says too. Sophie kissed his cheek, whispered in his ear. To Mars and back, Ba. To Mars and back, Butterfly. She jumped down and ran toward the school building, stopped at the door, turned around one more time. Ba, I'm proud of you. I was always proud, but now I get to tell everyone else why. The door closed behind her and Marcus sat on the bench for a long time, sun on his face. Life changed. Future uncertain, but for the first time in 13 years full of possibility instead of just survival.